Okay, welcome everyone. This is my pleasure to introduce you Erin Leahey, all the way from the University of Arizona. She's spending actually this year as a sabbatical at the University of Leiden in the Netherlands. She's professor of sociology there at the University of Arizona. She's working with a lot of interesting topics related to science of science, including inequality, interdisciplinarity, subfield integration, collaborative work, disruption and novelty, and also not just with regard to academic papers, but also with regard to patents, also diversity, specialization, promotion, also a little bit of synthesis of different disciplines. So it's all really a very impressive lifetime achievement on this field. And we are very honored that you accepted our invitation. She has published in a lot of top journals, including just recently in the American Sociological Review, Nature, Journal of Informatics, Research Policy, Scientometrics, Administrative Science Quarterly, and PNAS. So it is our pleasure that you are here. Thanks very much again. It is an announcement that this talk is going to be recorded. You can interrupt the seminar with questions for clarification, but we wait for the most questions at the end for the Q&A. Yeah, without further ado, the floor is yours. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you so much for the invitation. Can everyone hear me okay? Yes.
Yep.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you so much. It's really lovely to be here. It's nice to capitalize on my year in Europe. So yeah, it was only an hour flight, hour and a half or something, not 15. So anyway, lovely to be here and meet all of you and be part of all the great things happening at the Institute for Analytical Sociology. What I would like to do today is share I think the original plan was to share some published work. And then I emailed and said, well, I actually have this other thing. And so I sent in a title and an abstract and that has since changed. It's still the same project, but anyway, it's moving along. And this is very hot off the press stuff. We were running some regression models at the end of January. And so I think it's a really good time to get feedback, especially from folks like you in your group. Here we focus specifically on the role of what we often call kind of conditioning or moderating variable, but a lot of the theorizing is about mechanisms. And so I would really, really love your help tightening that up as we look forward to kind of, finishing the paper, doing some sensitivity analyses, and then submitting it for publication. So thank you so much for being here. The new title is How Scholarly Networks Shape the Use of Interdisciplinary Research. And my co-authors on this are a U of A PhD student who was in the School of Management, Eugene Peck. He's now in Mississippi. My PhD student, Gina Lee, who is also a co-author on, and Russell Funk. Actually, both of them were co-authors on the paper published in the American Sociological Review last year. Okay, so without further ado, I'll start with a definition of interdisciplinary research. There's a lot of talk about inter and multi and transdisciplinarity, but this is the definition that we base our work on. The key term here is integrate, right? So interdisciplinary research integrates some things, data or perspectives, concepts, disciplines, maybe most likely, or other bodies of specialized knowledge. So this is a definition that comes from a book published by the National Academy of Sciences in 2005 called Facilitating Interdisciplinary Research. Okay, so I think that's pretty straightforward. What are the goals? Why are funding agencies and governments, and not just in the US, trying to promote interdisciplinary research? Well, the aim is to advance, deeper, fundamental understanding of things that scientists are interested in, to solve problems whose solutions are beyond the scope of a single field or discipline. And maybe most relevant to the talk today is this last one, producing high impact. This is kind of the goal or the aim of interdisciplinary research, to produce high impact research, groundbreaking research. Another term used recently is transformative. We're hearing that a lot in science policy context in both Europe and the US, right? So those are the goals of interdisciplinary research, and we are seeing it promoted not just in this facilitating interdisciplinary research book that I had mentioned earlier, a more updated one in the US called convergence, which is a term that maybe hasn't quite taken off as much as some of these other terms, but I think partly people can't distinguish it between convergence from interdisciplinary research. What, how are they different? Why do we need a new concept if it's kind of the same thing, right? But we're also seeing it in Horizon Europe with some targeted opportunities to address global challenges, right? A lot of these are interdisciplinary in nature. And whether it's the targeted work or the more curiosity-driven research that the ERC is supporting, for example. I also wonder, I know a couple of you, maybe it's Maria, you have some funding from the Swedish Research Council. How is there emphasis on and desire for interdisciplinary scholarship? Yeah,
very much. In all of Swedish Research Councils, I think it's really
interesting. So I think it's maybe probably fair to say it's a pretty global phenomenon, right? And it's had staying power, right? I started studying interdisciplinary research in 2008. And it was a follow-on. I was doing a lot of work on specialization and studies within, and then spanning subfields. And then I started thinking about spanning fields. And then I just happened to start working on interdisciplinarity about the time this interest, right? There was this interesting confluence that, well, good for me in my research program, that for one time in my life, somebody was actually interested in the things that I study, right? But it stayed, right? That was 15 to, years ago now, right? More so, and there still seems to be this focus on interdisciplinary research. So especially for the people who are funding this kind of work, like, why are they funding it? What are they expecting to get out of it? What do they want to get out? What do they want the scientific community to get out of it? And maybe beyond the scientific community, right? When we're thinking about, deep social problems like, worldwide poverty, right? So how is interdisciplinary scholarship used by subsequent scholars? Right? Is it cited more, and does it achieve greater impact? So here we're thinking kind of a lot of the outcomes that I look at, for better or worse, are contained within the scientific community. So, impact, right, and citations are at minimum a measure of the kind of usefulness of the work, right? Are people citing it? Are other scientists engaging with the work and citing the work? They may not like it. They may not like it. Doesn't necessarily mean it's a positive evaluation. It tends to be more positive than negative when your work is cited. But it just means your work is generative. It's useful to people, right? So is interdisciplinary research cited more, achieving greater impact? And a related but different question and different outcome variable is about disruption. So is interdisciplinary research more disruptive? Right. So this is a term I will talk a lot about today, and have done some work on with my co-author Russ Funk. And highly disruptive work, what it will do in the extreme and rare instance, it will displace prior work, right? It will kind of sever ties, if you're thinking like network terms, between past scholarship and future scholarship, kind of interrupt that. Right? That's the most kind of extreme, maybe ideal, typical, but rare case of. Okay, so disruptive work, whether it's papers or patents, which with Russ and his advisor Jason Owen Smith at the University of Michigan, they developed this measure in a 2017 paper in Management Science. Disruptive work displaces previous work and reroutes knowledge streams. So I think the term, she wasn't really thinking about the disruption measure, but Naomi Oreskes called it like a bend in the road. It creates a bend in the road. So if you're thinking about knowledge streams and knowledge building on prior knowledge, right, there's a discontinuity, okay, at minimum. So this measure, I think, really resonates with a lot of juxtapositions in kind of classic sociology of science. So we have Bourdieu's idea of risky subversion. That might be what a disruptive work is doing. Kuhn's depiction of paradigm shifting science. I think there's got to be a connection here. I can't imagine having a paradigm shift without at least one disruptive paper, at the ASR reviewers didn't really like that, so that got toned down in the last review, but I think there's a strong connection there. Mulcahy's idea, his concept of displacement and Feyerabend's measure of, or concept of replacement. I think these are all very, very deep, and someone's got to do some sort of conceptual, I don't know if it'll be me or not, right? Work on this, but these are the kinds of concepts that this disruptiveness is capturing. To give you a sense of it, we're not at the data and methods section yet, but I think it's kind of hard to get your head around a lot of this stuff that we'll be studying without a sense of the measure. And I think there's also a lot of people are using this term disruption now. I mean, they're in ways that don't map on to the measure. And one interesting story is that in this original article, Funk and Owen Smith submitted it, and they said, well, we developed this thing called the CD index, and C stands for consolidating, and D stands for disruption, and it's this continuum. The reviewers didn't like it. They said, there's already a thing called disruption out there. You know, disruptive innovations, right, from the innovation technology literature, and that's not what this is. You can't call it disruption. And so they changed it. In this article, they do not use this term. This is maximally destabilizing. The D in their CD index is actually destabilizing, shake things up, like create those bends in the road, right? And then lo and behold, after it's published and people start using the measure, criticizing the measure, coming up with kind of tweaks to, improve the measure, everyone's calling it, now it's even the D index, like the D score, disruptive score, right? But in the original paper, they wanted to call it disruption, but they weren't allowed to call it disruption. And then everyone just, whatever. So anyway, a funny little story. Okay, so what's the point here? This is the focal paper we are trying to, a paper we are trying to characterize as maybe more or less disruptive. Okay, that's what the gray thing. The red things are the things it cites. So we're controlling here in this example, this is just an example, fake data. These red, each focal paper, this one and this one, are citing four works, and they're red. So we're controlling for the number of papers in the bibliography, the number of works cited. We're also controlling for the number of papers that cite the focal. It's 6, right? We have the green ones over here and the blue ones over here. Okay, so there is still a difference here between these. This focal article is as consolidating as you can get, the lowest score on the CD index. Why? Because the papers that cite it all cite at least one of its foundational works or prior works or the stuff in the bibliography, the works cited, right? So this focal paper is very enmeshed in the generations of scholarship, right? There's continuity, there's no bend in the road, right? It's like that sounds almost it, but chugging along, right? Building on this work's building on the focal paper, as well as still incorporating some of that prior art in the patent world, right? Or the work cited in the paper world. In contrast, the maximally disruptive papers, there's no connection. This is very rare. There are no connections. The papers who are citing the focal paper have ignored completely the foundational work, the prior art. Okay, so this is a maximally different. Most papers are really in the middle of this, right? These are ideal, typical, and rare, and they don't exist in the data that I will be sharing with you today. These two ideal, typical exchanges. Questions, comments?
And this is irregardless of interdisciplinary or not. I guess it happens even before interdisciplinary works.
Super good question. We have a separate measure of the degree to which these focal papers here are interdisciplinary or not. So the answer is yes. And in the ASR paper that we published last year, we created a reviewer was very concerned that maybe the CD index was capturing some of this some interdisciplinarity. So we created the CD index only looking at both works cited as well as the citing papers from one's own field. And from those connections, we recalculated the CD index, subscript this or whatever, like intradisciplinary CD index, right? To try to get it. But here for this paper, we have a separate measure of interdisciplinary. So, yeah, good question. Okay, so in addition to looking at impact and disruptiveness, We are particularly interested in the nature, maybe we should be calling it the structure. I'd love to get your feedback on this, the talk, the nature of the scholar's audience and how does that audience shape the use of interdisciplinary research. So this is kind of the audience characteristic is the key moderator conditioning variable that we think might affect the relationship between interdisciplinary research and impact, and the relationship between interdisciplinarity and interdisciplinary research and disruption. Okay, so what we're thinking about here, the scholar's audience. Who's your audience? What is your audience? I think we could also easily think of it as a network. A scholar's audience is the group of people that is connected to something through, say, some field affiliations. We were just talking about method sections of the American Sociological Association, journals. This group of people is likely to be exposed to the scholar's work, to become aware of it, right, through search algorithms and word of mouth, courses, reading other people's work. And this group of people is also maybe well prepared to receive the scholar's work, right? They're not just exposed to it, they're prepared to receive it, assess it, use it themselves, right? It's kind of connected to what they do or their scholarly identity. Audiences can be more or less interconnected, and this is the kind of key feature of the audience or the network that we are going to be looking at today and we'll be sharing with you today is how interconnected is this the scholar's audience. And we can think of this as maybe a network density, the density of one's network, right? Interconnected audience. And this, Carolee, in one of your papers, I think this is the science metrics one, the term you used was social embeddedness of scientific production, right? And so here, I think we're maybe kind of getting at something like the social embeddedness of scientific reception, or receiving it, who's kind of being exposed to it and okay. So we suspect that interdisciplinary research will have higher impact, right? And this is there's a lot of research has been done on this by other people. The idea here is that bringing together ideas from different disciplines leads to higher impact science as gauged by the number of citations, again, citation count. Rudimentary, again, probably indicating usefulness, not necessarily likes, right? But there are a number of studies, some by me, by a bunch of other folks, who have found that interdisciplinary research tends to be higher impact research. Okay? So that's yeah. We are expecting a positive effect of IDR on impact for two reasons. A couple of maybe mechanisms. Love to get your feedback on these. One's a kind of a quantity argument and one's a quality argument. So first, the quantity argument. This is about not just team size, but also audience size. So think quantity, like size of the audience, right? So IDR teams, interdisciplinary research teams, tend to be larger. And they have, with more people on the team, you're going to most likely, if there's not complete redundancy in those scholars' networks, have a larger audience as well, right? Because it draws from multiple fields, IDR is likely to appeal to multiple fields. And if you appeal to multiple fields or audiences, that is one route to scholarly influence. We see this from Michelle Lamont. I think this was actually your dissertation. She did a case study of Jacques Derrida. And I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly, Maya. Yes, okay. That's one of the things that she found, right, is this kind of broad appeal. And Liz Clemens, in this AJS paper, found that scholars and her co-authors, scholars able to master multiple genres are more likely to gain entry to multiple conversations, right? So think bigger audience, right? Interdisciplinary research, lots of ideas, lots of team members typically, and that's gonna gain, you're going to gain entry to multiple conversations. So you may have a larger prospective audience, right? So IDR, we expect to have a larger potential audience. So this is the quantity argument, like bigger audience. Now for the quality argument, here we draw on, are all of you familiar with recombinant innovation theory? oh, this is so cool. Recombinant innovation. What is recombinant? The extreme form of recombinant innovation theory is that there are no new ideas and all new ideas are simply combinations or new combinations of extant existing ideas, right? So that's the extreme form of recombinant innovation, right? There's some cool, this is an ethnographic work, right, of that finds that combining ideas from different fields leads to new and more useful insights. Like that's where the light bulbs are going off, is when we're doing that, right? Another aspect of the quality argument might be team diversity. So there's some literature that suggests that interdisciplinary research teams, they tend to be diverse, epistemologically diverse. We're not thinking like demographically diverse, but epistemologically, and diverse teams produce higher quality. So that's the quality argument. So we think IDR should have the higher impact for both quantity and quality reasons. And that is our first hypothesis. The more interdisciplinary a paper is, the greater its impact. Notice it's all paper level, right? Paper. We're going to be measuring interdisciplinarity at the paper level, and we're going to be measuring in paper level. Okay, so the other outcome of interest to us is disruption. We're actually going to dichotomize it and look at kind of likelihood of being like highly disruptive. Right? We expect a positive effect here as well. And we expect this for several reasons, all of which pertain to the transfer of ideas and the integration of ideas. Remember the definition of interdisciplinary research is about integration, right? So ideas moving across different knowledge domains, right? And so here are these 4 reasons, and especially these are mechanisms we are thinking about and theorizing about. We do not have measures of these things, at least at the moment. And I'd especially love your feedback on this. Okay, so here's the novelty argument. As IDR teams, interdisciplinary research teams, pool knowledge across different knowledge domains, they release untapped potential, they develop novel insights, and may even prompt breakthroughs and more like disruption and bends in the road and things like that. So this is all based on some prior work. IDR often develops or applies methods adopted from other fields. So my former student, Sharon Kopman, and I have this paper, 2019 paper in research policy that looks at, we kind of wanted to call them boutique methods, but we thought that didn't sound so good because people might develop them. Unconventional methods, or kind of unconventional methods. A lot of methods come from other fields. I mean, here you have computational social science, maybe a great example. Think of event history analysis. I think it was, what was it, like failure time? It was like, came from engineering, and how long does it take before the light bulb dies, right? And then Nancy Tuma and others starting to apply it to so a lot of methods that we use come from other fields. Another great example, my former colleague, he's now at Irvine, Charles Reagan, developed qualitative comparative analysis, QCA, that a lot of political scientists use. He developed that. I mean, that also had some basis in engineering and mathematics. And what I found in a paper published last year with Gina Lee and Russ Funk is that new methods, right, these maybe unconventional new methods that could, or at least new to the field, promote disruption of knowledge streams. That is the type of novelty that is most likely to lead to a disruption or a bend in the road. So that's the novelty argument, right? That interdisciplinary research it tends to be associated with novelty, new things, new methods, and it's the novelty that's prompting the disruption. Okay, second argument, possible mechanism is polysemy, different interpretations, right? So multifaceted ideas like interdisciplinary research can be received differently by different people. Your interpretation of it might be different than my interpretation of it, right? Because maybe we come from different fields, and what I see interesting and important is different from what you see as interesting and important. I think this is very well laid out. I think this paper, was published in Social Networks. Anna Kuchenius, who's a PhD student in Amsterdam, and her advisors wrote this amazing mixed method paper looking at the use of Mark Granovetter's strength of weak ties concept, right? How it is used and interpreted differently by different scholarly communities. They're all using it, they're all citing it. So if you're just looking at number of citations, you're missing a large part of the story, right? The reasons why people are using it and what they are getting out of it and how they are using it is different. So different communities do. So we think that interdisciplinary research is likely to foster this kind of polysomy, right, which will then prompt some disruption. There's also a synthesis argument that might be, we don't measure synthesis, but we're thinking that that may be part of the reason why interdisciplinary research, we expect it to be more disruptive. Often, not always, interdisciplinary research has this kind of synthesizing function, the pulling together, the integrating, right? Synthesizing existing ideas from various knowledge domains. And as a result, an IDR paper may begin to serve instead, in lieu of that prior art, that foundational work. Like sometimes a meta-analysis might. Meta-analysis, oh, you use all these data and coefficients from all these studies and then do a meta-analysis. Oh, that everyone just pays attention to the meta-analysis and oh, bye-bye, these works, no, people don't pay attention to anymore. McMahon and McFarlane in their recent ASR paper also found that review papers tend to serve this function. Often we think if our paper ends up being cited in a review paper, we're like, oh, that's great, I made it into a review paper. It's actually, on average, not good for you. Because if people just start to cite the review paper, but not the, for the most part, not the works that it cites, okay? So it starts to, so the IDR work might, to the extent that it synthesizes prior work, may also start to stand in lieu of it instead of it, right? And so people are citing the IDR work, but not the IDR works, cited works, bibliography, hence prompting disruption. Last mechanism is, I just added this one like last night, and we referred to it, familiarity or lack thereof. IDR work is multifaceted and should appeal to folks in many different fields, right? If you're combining, linguistics and psychology and you're putting it together in one paper, chances are you've got some psychologists interested in the work and you've also got some linguists interested in the work. But these folks, right, may not be aware of all the foundational work cited in the IDR paper. The linguists are probably not going to be aware, less likely to be aware of the psych work that it has been cited, and the psychologists are less aware of the linguistics work, for example. This lack of familiarity may boost disruptive potential. In other words, these psychologists and linguists, right, who are drawn to this interdisciplinary work that combines both fields, they may cite that interdisciplinary paper, but not its references, or at least not half of its references, right? And so I just don't know that work. I find this work really interesting. I just don't know that work. It's not my field. That's me also. So this kind of familiarity or lack of. Okay, so for these 4 reasons, we expect that the more interdisciplinary a paper is, the more likely it is to be highly disruptive relative to other papers in its field. Okay, so this is what I've kind of developed so far, right? Are these 2 main effects. Interdisciplinary research should have a positive effect on impact. That's our first hypothesis we'll test, and it should also have a positive effect on disruption. So that's our conceptual model. Now we'll move into this idea of the moderator, the audience interconnectedness. How might it shape IDR's effect on these 2 outcomes? When a scholar's audience is more interconnected, we expect that IDR's positive effect on impact will be reinforced. Positive interaction effect. Audience members share knowledge and norms. They may also share an assessment of a paper's usefulness. And if they do, that will spread more easily through an interconnected community than it would through a disconnected community. And penalties to domain spanning, this comes from kind of the categories literature in management science. Penalties to domain spanning or boundary spanning, which are, for example, I think this is, Ezra Zuckerman's probably the one who started this work. If things span knowledge domains, the typical consumer, audience member, doesn't know where to place it. What is this thing? Where does it fit? Where does it belong? That means they're a little unsure. They're kind of maybe a little confused. There's some uncertainty. And usually when we experience uncertainty and confusion, this is what we do as human beings. I don't like it. I don't know it. I don't get it. It doesn't fit in the boxes I know, right? And so I'm going to devalue it, right? But we think when the audience is more interconnected, right, that these typical penalties to domain spanning, which have been documented in many domains, not just science, they should be less severe. So we think that audience interconnectedness will kind of reinforce, right? So there'll be this positive interaction effect between IDR and audience interconnectedness, bolstering citations. But when a scholar's audience is more interconnected, we think that IDR's positive effect on disruption, that second main effect, will be reduced. So the interaction effect here we expect to be negative. So an interconnected audience will see and appreciate the synthesis that IDR is producing. The interconnected audience will be more aware of that prior work that maybe comes from multiple fields, and maybe especially share an appreciation of it. The psychologist won't be like, oh, that's linguistics, I don't know it, I don't like it. They're more likely to say like, hey, yeah, cool, interesting things can be gleaned from that, right? And an interconnected audience will not view IDR, will be less likely to view IDR work as a replacement, right? Remember the meta-analyses and the synthesis, like standing instead of or in lieu of. And an interconnected audience, we think, will be more likely to say, hey, yeah, cool IDR work. And yeah, I kind of see those connections to that prior work. So I'm going to continue to keep them bundled, right? I'm not going to just use this one and ignore the prior work. So we think that audience interconnectedness, that will have a negative effect on the positive relationship we expect between IDR and disruptive. And here is just a summary of those interaction effects. Where are we for time? We're about 30 minutes.
Yeah.
Okay. Before I move into the data and our methods and things like that, any questions or comments? This is a clarifying question. Everyone's good? Okay. All right, so here's what we do. I can tell you why later, but for now, we hope to expand this, but we study 14 research universities in the United States. These include public universities, large public universities like Ohio State, and also private universities like Northwestern. And then we draw on data from the Web of Science. So what we did is we sampled papers that were published between, in this 4-year period and inclusive 2008 to 2011, that included at least one author who was affiliated with one of these universities. Okay. And then we select there are about 64,000 scholars affiliated with these 14 universities during this time period. And they had to have published at least 3 papers in that 4-year period to be included in our sample. And this is just simply because a lot of our measures are based on publications and publication metadata. You don't publish much or we can't have a measure of a lot of the things we're interested in. And so we analyzed the roughly 660,000 papers that they published in this period. Again, the period is 2008 to 2011, as long as those papers have 10 or more references, works cited. Okay. Again, we have can measure things of interest like this. Okay, so the outcomes of interest to us, these should be no surprise at this point. The first one is impact, right? The second one is disruption, and these are measured at the paper level. So every paper has like an impact score and a disruption score. And then our key explanatory variable is also measured at the paper level. And this is how interdisciplinary the paper is. And I'll talk a little bit about that, the measure that we use there. It's the same one I've used in prior work. And the moderator of interest is actually at the author level. Okay, and this is the audience, the scholar's audience, and how interconnected it is. Okay, so the moderator is at the author level. It's just important. Question then?
How do you, is that like the main author or the average across all authors or?
Oh, yeah. Good question, hard to answer. Cool. There are not many, but some, okay. In our data, okay, we have, it's only the author that is associated with, at least during one of the periods of study, one of the universities in our study And then we go get all their papers during that time period, okay? So if a co-author is kind of like on the study or whatever, like, but that co-author wasn't affiliated with one of those 14 universities from 2008 to 2011, we're just like, oh yeah, we're like, you're not. So it's, yeah. Does that answer your question?
Yes.
You're shaking your head, so I think I'm making sense, even though I feel like I'm blabbering. Okay. So yeah, it's not even the main author or the first author or yeah. I think we need to add this. I mean, yeah, that would require more data collection, but it might be, I think, a more valid measure of the audience, the prospective audience for that paper, right? Right now, we're kind of ignoring an author or co-author or two of some of these papers. Well, if someone remember that, I have a pen somewhere that I'm going to pull out during Q&A, but that's we need to do that. That's a great suggestion. Yes. I'm going to add it to the to-do list. Okay. So measuring impact is at paper level. We follow previous research, including my own, that relies on citation counts for better or worse to measure impact or at least usefulness. You know, like the term impact, you think of the usefulness of the paper. So this is the number of citations accrued by the paper as of 2017. Remember, all the papers were published between 2008 and 2011. So there's been time. We still also control for year publication, but there's been time to accrue citations, right? Okay, and then disruption, what are we doing to measure disruption or destabilization as Russ and Jason would maybe, or at least their reviewers would prefer? We use the CD index that I've already introduced you to. A lot of people are using this. They have called it the disruption index or the D score. There have been a couple of variants proposed by various folks, with Orman and others, that we also need to look at, as I've done in my previous work. And again, this relies on citation patterns, backward citations, the references, forward citations, the citing papers, right? To understand the extent to which the focal paper, that green diamond, right, increases or decreases reliance on the predecessors. Right? Is it, continuity or discontinuity? We measure this CD index in 2017, the same time we measure the other outcome variable impact in the citations. And it ranges from -1, theoretically, -1 to 1. -1 is the most consolidating, 1 is the most disruptive. These values don't even exist in the data, they're rare. And following Wu, Wang, and Evans, and because of the right skewed distribution of the CD index, we dichotomize the CD index, distinguishing highly disruptive papers, which fall within the top 5th percentile of this continuous CD index from all other articles. Okay, and yeah, we will look, and I have looked at previous work, like changing that cutoff a little bit, right? Okay. Now to measure the key explanatory variable interdisciplinary research, we use Alan Porter and Ishmael Rafols developed a measure of what they call integration. I've used it in my prior work. A lot of people have used it. It's, I think, better than alternatives. What's an alternative? Self-report? Is your work interdisciplinary or not? Is this, or what does the author say, right? There's also some binary measures of interdisciplinarity that a bunch of people are using. There is, for example, it's almost like registry data for anyone who receives a PhD in North America. Voluntarily takes a survey when you hand in your dissertation. I say that because no one who would not do it. You're just like, just give me the degree, I'm doing this because I'm old enough that I handed in my dissertation on acid-free paper that cost $17 a read. It wasn't a jump drive or upload to Box. Anyway, in this survey of doctoral recipients, they ask people, like, was your dissertation interdisciplinary? If so, what's your main field, sociology? And what if it was interdisciplinary, please tell us the other field. And a lot of people have been using that binary and self-reported measure of interdisciplinarity in their research. That's not what we do here. So interdisciplinary research is based on, borrowing knowledge. Think of recombinant innovation, right? There's there's some psychology stuff, some linguistic stuff. I'm gonna, put them together. And so what we rely on, or Alan Porter and Ishmael Rafols do, is the referenced papers. To understand how interdisciplinary the gray diamond is, the focal paper, we look to what kind of work are they integrated, right? In this day and age, especially with access to full text, right? I imagine, I don't know if anyone's working on this right now, that might be even better or as good to look at the content of the paper itself, right? But this is not looking at the contents of the paper or what's in the abstract. It's looking at what is in the references to understand how interdisciplinary the paper is. Articles are classified into about 250 fields. These are called subject categories in the web of science. Sociology is a subject category. Management is a subject category. Demography is a subject category, just to give you a sense, right? So they kind of mostly map onto disciplines. And these subject categories are assigned to journals, not articles, journals. So ASR's subject category is sociology. ASQ, Administrative Science Quarterly, has two subject categories, sociology and management. Okay, so it's very rare to have up to 6, but they do exist. Okay, so this cool measure of interdisciplinary research looks at not just the variety of subject categories that are showing up in the bibliography. Is it 10? Is it 1? Is everything I cite coming from sociology? Right? Or are there a panoply of disciplines or subject categories represented in the bibliography? So look at the variety, look at the evenness of that distribution, the balance it's called, and really coolly, how closely related those subject categories that are in your bibliography are to each other. Are you citing like physics and geography and geology? Well, all of it, and linguistics, or are you citing sociology and demography? Much more closely related, okay? So the cool thing about their measure, and I won't go into too much more detail than this, is that it has these 3 components and they're all wrapped into it. It's not just the number of disciplines or subject categories that are showing up in the bibliography. It's not just how evenly they're distributed. Like, are you mostly citing sociology and a tiny bit of demography? Or is it kind of like split evenly, right? But there's also the disparity, how closely related they are. And the understanding here is if you're stretching further, like going, there are cognate fields like sociology and anthropology, right? But then there are other fields that are much more kind of distant in conceptual space or epistemically less related, right? And so there the thinking is that some interdisciplinary, if you're reaching further, that the work is more interdisciplinary. Right? So a paper's IDR score increases as it references more unique and relatively disparate, or often called distant, far away, in cognitive epistemological space subject categories. And there's a formula, there's formulas. IDR score ranges from 0 to 1, with scores closer to 1 indicating greater discipline. Okay, so 2 papers could have the exact same IDR score, even if one cites works from 3 social science fields and one cites works from 3 natural science fields, right? It's not the fields themselves, right? It's the number of them, it's how evenly distributed they are, and it's their relatedness or lack of. Ben?
Carl, explain it.
Carl, where's that?
Just because was this your measure?
Oh, your Ben.
Porter?
Okay, sorry.
Was this your measure or was this from Porter?
Porter, and yeah, Alan Porter.
This is from Porter, yeah.
Exactly.
Okay.
And it is equivalent to, if you've ever heard of the Rao-Sterling index. It's the same thing. I don't think you realize that, but other people have realized it since.
Just one question.
Yeah.
So then this measure, it just looks at every reference in the reference list, and then it tries to, for each INJ, computes the
Yes,
sum, and then, okay.
yes, yes.
Right.
So it will calculate, like, let's look at the bibliography for this paper. We'll try to understand how interdisciplinary it is. Let's look at the bibliography. How many different disciplines are represented in that bibliography? 1, 5, 10, right? How evenly distributed are those disciplines that are represented in the bibliography, and how related or unrelated are they? Yeah,
The related
Carl.
question. This is so amazing. We were sitting here thinking, is this a kind of online tool where we can check our papers or papers in general to do it?
Oh, someone should have developed that. I remember using this for the first time in a paper published in 2017, and the reviewer was like, you need to show us how. I'm like, someone else has already published the paper, like all about this measure. But we developed like a little Excel like demo, with some fake data, like, right, just to make it more intuitive for folks. Maybe I can ask Ishmael. Ishmael is affiliated with CWTS. He lives in,
Yeah, it's an amazing mission.
It's pretty cool. Most measures, I mean, like you've probably heard of the Herfindahl index. Has anyone heard of the Herfindahl index? Like the Herfindahl index, which I also use to measure specialization in scholars' research programs, only looks at these two, right? Herfindahl index is not taking into consideration the relatedness of those. It's just kind of like how many and what's their relative. You were talking about the, you know, the S and the J, Sullivan, right? The I and the J, their relative distribution, the proportions, right? Of Erin's research is 50% in this field and 50% in that field, right? So, you know, I cite work from two different fields and I do so kind of evenly, like that, like a Herfindahl index, a measure of like spread for a categorical variable, right? Or actually it's concentration. So people usually use one minus their Herfindahl index to measure spread, right? Doesn't include this part.
So this index doesn't take into account the outlet where the work has been published.
It's true.
So basically it could also be at a very different place, which creates, of course, probably.
Could be a very interdisciplinary paper published in a disciplinary journal. It could be a very disciplinary paper, only cites sociology, published in an interdisciplinary. So no regard whatsoever for the journal and publication. Also, another question I often get is, well, why don't you just measure interdisciplinary research from affiliations of the co-authors, right? Thinking again of the team. Oh, a sociologist is collaborating with a demographer and someone from information science or whatever, right? Yay, it's an interdisciplinary team. That's another way to do it. That's also, you know, data intensive, but increasingly possible. In the past, the Web of Science only had the affiliation for the corresponding author. They did change that. And oftentimes now it just says University of Arizona. Doesn't say sociology. So it's just a little, I think that's the main reason people have moved, you know, at least quantitative science scholars have moved away from it. But there's certainly other ways to capture how interdisciplinary a paper is. But this one's, yeah. Like the journal publishing, is it published in an interdisciplinary journal? Is the audience, this is all about like the work it's drawing on. Remember that definition with the word integrate, like what is it pulling from? But maybe an interdisciplinary paper is one that appeals to an interdisciplinary audience. And so you want to look at the distribution of disciplines of the citing authors, right? I mean, there's, but this is what we do. I've got the woman in blue sweater.
That's okay. I'm Laura. I'm just wondering how you define this very intuitively. We know that sociology and demography are closer than sociology and I don't know physics, but how do you?
Yeah. What we do is we created, there's say roughly 250, they change over time, complicating thing. What things change for researchers. 250 say in most time periods, subject categories, soc, anthropology, demography. We create a matrix, right? A subject category by subject category, 250 rows, 250 columns matrix, main diagonal undefined. What's in the off diagonals? It's a symmetric matrix. And what is in the off diagonals is the cosine similarity, like the cosine similarity of those two, of that I and that J. Okay. And so the how close or distant two fields are to each other is determined by their co-occurrence.
Wait, sorry, can you clarify, was that from the journal or from the citations or from the, because you can make many matrices based on this, right?
For this work, the co-occurrence, the values in the off diagonals are not determined by the co-occurrences in our data, but in science. In the entire Web of Science. And maybe I'm not answering your question, you're being polite and nodding. Your question
The
was.
papers in science, not the journals or. Because I guess there's like what people publish versus what the venues are also.
Yeah,
all of them.
Yeah, yeah.
All,
Or just-
all journals.
So the journals have this categories, So you could build a matrix off of this, I'm guessing, and then you could also build a matrix off of the citations in the paper.
I think I need to check. I want to tell you what I think this is. I think it is based on not, some journals have 2 or more subject categories, right? So it's not, if there are a lot of journals that combine social and management, which there are, it's not just ASQ, right? I think it's more based on the co-occurrence of those journals, whether they're co-cited in bibliographies.
Mhm.
I think it's the latter, but I need to check. Been a long time since yes, I used it as well. I shouldn't. Good question. Okay, glad there's interest in the IDR measure. I like it. I like it too. Okay, this is our key moderator. Okay, the audience interconnectedness. So here what we use is a pretty standard measure of network density. And the nodes in this network are these 250 journal, like the subject categories that are attached to the journals. Okay. Ties between nodes exist when a journal represents 2 subject categories, right? So there's no tie if it's just like, ASR, right? But if it's ASR, if it's ASQ has 2 subject categories attached to it. It's sociology and management. So ASQ as a journal would create a tie between social and management, 2 different nodes, right? And so if more journals also have those 2 subject categories, you can have up to 6, and a given journal can have up to 6, then the value of that tie will increase correspondingly. Carl.
You weigh by sort of journal size and the magnitude, because I guess that also plays into.
Can I get my pen?
Just the pen. Pen object
In the curling? Oh, there's my pen. Thank you. Okay, so many questions. So many good ideas. Okay, Carl, okay, we're gonna have to go back. So, you said what size of the journal?
But now I feel bad for asking. Is it weighted by the size of the journal and sort of the impact?
The answer is no, but I think that would be a good idea.
Might be, I don't know. A Q1 journal, so a certain size, so there is enough output. I understand what you do with affiliation here, and the occurrences, the co-occurrences of referencing headings and the same combinations of S's that defines the cosine. I understand that, but yeah, maybe it could be weighted as well.
It could be. Yeah. I like that. Okay, let's go back to the other, if you then. I already said the last thing, right? So the ties are valued using the prevalence of the pairing, that SC by SC combination, like social management, in the entire network, the scholars network, the entire network. Okay, so the next step in measuring audience interconnectedness is to zoom in on just the scholars network, right? Most people haven't published in journals that cover 250 subject categories, right? We publish in a smaller set of journals with a smaller set of subject categories. So our audiences, right, a given scholar's network or audience is smaller than doesn't have 250 nodes in it. So network density is the ratio of actual ties or potential ties that exist in each scholar's audience. And the scholar's audience is made up of the nodes in this audience, this network, are the subject categories that represent the journals in which the scholar published between 2008 and 2011. So if I only published an ASR and ASQ in this 4-year period, I would have two nodes in my network, sociology and management. And then we take tie strength into account. Remember, these are they can be valued, right? And we calculate the density of researcher I's audience as this is actual ties for researcher I, and this is potential over potential ties of researcher I. And that is our measure of audience interconnectedness. It's a measure of density in one's network, okay, based on where you're publishing. So a little bit related added to your question. Control variables. Some of these really important. If you read the abstract for what was sent around to who knows how many people, we talked about diversity, right? Which is something we've kind of moved into control variable. It used to be kind of one of our key variables. It was getting a little unwieldy. How productive the author's been, the gender of the author, professional age, a lot of paper level, important paper level controls like journal impact factor. We're looking at number of times a paper's been cited, right? And how interdisciplinary that, the work is. What are some things that could, potentially cause both of those things, right? Number of references in the paper, number of subject categories, the journal it's published in, how old the paper is, basically when it's published, how big the team is, right? Number of authors. And then we had about 2 or 3 measures of just like resources at the university level, and they're all very highly correlated. So we just ended up picking university size. Okay, our analytic approach is we use a time-sensitive design. We conduct an article level analysis. We account for clustering within scholars, right? So we can have scholars with multiple papers in the data set. It's a nested, like long format data set. We use some general linear models. When we look at impact or number of citations, we use negative binomial, right? So a lot of papers have like 0 citations, right? And then when we look at this dichotomized version of the CD index, the D score, we use logistic regression for nested data. And for now, we're using listwise deletion. I never let my students write dissertations using listwise deletion. That's where we are right now, but we will probably move on to multiple imputation to the extent it's compatible with these models. Okay, descriptively, what do you want? What should we point out here? Okay, the mean number of citations a paper gets is about 30, 29.6. The minimum is 0. The max is huge. We can aspire or something to the CD score. Remember, it ranged from 0 to 1, and I was saying, oh, these are ideal, typical, and don't really exist. Okay, this is the minimum in our data, negative 0.55. This is the maximum in our data. Okay, so it's like really truncated in both. And then we have the IDR score that also ranged theoretically from 0 to 1, but in our data it ranges 0 to 0.88. And the average is 0.53. It's kind of hard to interpret this. Remember, the IDR scores like variety and balance and how related they are, right? But the range is 0 to 1 theoretically, and the mean in our data is 0.53. And this is that audience interconnectedness density measure, right? And so for the most part, the min 0, max is 1, like perfectly dense scholarly network. But for the most part, on average, maybe they're not so interconnected, right? And I think, this is partly a function of like a lot of journals. I think it's about 50 or 60% of journals that are in the Web of Science only have one subject category attached to them, like AS or SOC, right? So that audience interconnectedness has a lot to do with publishing in multidisciplinary journals that get 2 or more subject categories assigned to them. Okay, multivariate effects on impact. Okay, here, this is a main effect of interest. This is our hypothesis 1 right here. There's all sorts of control variables in here too, and another brought the model. I'm happy to share with you, but this here tells us that papers that are interdisciplinary, right, have more citations, right? There's a positive and significant effect on citations. Okay, so if you go from a paper, 1 unit change, it's a 21% increase in citations, a 1 unit change in the IDR score is going from like not at all interdisciplinary to maximally interdisciplinary, right? Which doesn't even exist in our data. It leads to 20% more citations. So it's not huge, but it's significant, and it's positive in support of our first hypothesis. And then in this model, in addition to all the control variables, we're adding in this interaction effect between interdisciplinary research and interconnectedness. And as expected, this is a positive and significant interaction effect on the positive effect of IDR on impact. Okay, and figures always help with interaction terms. Okay, so IDR's effect on impact is greater when the audience is interconnected. Here, the yellow line, if you can see colors, I hope, audience interconnectedness is at its greatest, right? Okay, so here on the x-axis, we have the extent to which the paper is interdisciplinary. And remember, it goes up to 0.88 in our data. And then here is count of citations. Remember, the mean was about like 29. What we see is when the audience is most interconnected, that's where we see the steepest line, the steepest relationship, right, between IDR and impact or citations. Yeah.
Could this be because you can't be interconnected if you're not publishing in a journal that, no, it's not, okay, no, because it doesn't take into account the outlet, sorry, yes.
Yes. Now looking at disruption as outcome, not impact, but disruption. So again, lots of control variables here. The outcome variable is binary, right? Are you like highly disruptive? Is the paper highly disruptive or not? This is our second hypothesis, this main effect of interdisciplinary research on disruptiveness. Again, we see a positive and statistically significant effect. Okay. And what might be of most interest is this interaction effect in the next model, where we see that, yes, the effect of interdisciplinary research on likelihood of being disruptive is positive and significant. And this is the main effect of audience interconnectedness, and here's the interaction effect between the two. I've never had a paper where like all our hypotheses are actually supported. So we have a lot of sensitivity analysis because I don't know if I'm pretty confident in this, but I'm pleasantly surprised, but this has never happened before. But this is negative and significant interaction effect. So here, so IDR's effect on disruption or likelihood of being highly disruptive is weaker when the audience is interconnected. For all those, we hope, reasons, remember, it's like polyphony and novelty and synthesis and all these kind of reasons why we thought this might be things. So here we have audience interconnectedness at the maximum is the yellow line again, right? And when the audience is most interconnected, right? The people kind of prepared to receive this interdisciplinary work. As a paper becomes, if a paper is more interdisciplinary, audience interconnectedness, that's when, okay, let's start with the blue line. This is the completely disconnected audience. The scholar has not published in any multidisciplinary outlets, okay? Completely disconnected audience, they're chunks. There's the social people you talk to, and then there's the management people you talk to, but they don't connect, right? So an interdisciplinary paper presented to a completely disconnected audience has a very high likelihood of being highly disruptive. But as the audience gets a little more enmeshed, right, and interconnected and dense, then we see that interdisciplinary research's effect on disruption gets tempered. Alexandra.
Yeah, I have a question. So would it be wrong to interpret this graph in a way that if an audience is exposed to more interdisciplinary research, then also they grow more interconnected over time. So the more interdisciplinary research there is, the more likely an audience is also connected. And that's why we observe this effect. Is this interpretation reasonable, or would it be wrong to assume that this is kind of the story the graph tells as well?
Can you say it again?
Okay, so I guess I reversed the causality error. So my guess was now, the more interdisciplinary research there is, the more chances there were, or the more opportunities the audience of both disciplines, or several disciplines, had to connect together already.
Yeah.
So the more interdisciplinary research happened in an area, the likelier the audience is interconnected, and that's why we observe this, or like we see the graph as it is. Would that be a wrong conclusion from that, or does it make sense in your mind?
Yeah. So you are noting a possible and likely relationship between the two independent variables, right? That we have multiplied by, right?
Yeah.
And saying that that makes sense, and there may very well be a reason why interdisciplinary papers are maybe more likely to have an interdisciplinary audience / interconnected audience, right?
Yeah.
Because if it is the case that interdisciplinary papers are more likely to be published in interdisciplinary journals. May
Yeah.
very well be the case. I could look at that in the data that we have, right? This is related to your question a little bit earlier, Marie, about outlet, right? There could be interdisciplinary papers published in ASR, with just one subject, right? So, yes, I think there is these two, as most independent variables usually are, especially ones with an interaction effect, related to each other. Correlated. I think you're asking, is there a kind of causal relate, right? Is it like the IDR papers kind of create interconnected audiences?
Yeah, and if repeatedly these types of research are getting published, then the audience also interconnects more, and then every next interdisciplinary paper would have less disruptive capacity, kind of, because the audience is already so used to interdisciplinary work. And this is what I thought when looking at this graph, and I wanted to ask you whether it would be right or.
And that's where I was pushing you, what is the connection to disruption, right? But from your question, what I could understand is, okay, there might be this connection between these two independent variables that we also saw some connection between and said, hey, they probably have this interactive effect, but it was, what is the effect on disruption? And you just stated that. So, well, I think to answer that question, we need more time-sensitive analysis than we have already. The only way in which our analysis is time-sensitive right now is we have all our independent variables measured in like 2008, 2011 period, and then the outcomes are many years later in 2017. And so that's why we feel like, oh, it could be times, but it's not so much what is like more like, say, annual or fine-grained interplay between these things. I will definitely give that some more thought. Yeah. Thank you. Okay, so lots of robustness checks that we are working on. Happy to add to this list, right? Again, this was like the first study of my career where we're like, oh, wow, hypothesis, like a lot of thinking. And I happen to be one of these people who does like a lot of thinking before any analysis. I know it's a little old school and there's abduction now and whatever, but that's not my style. I'm like, oh my gosh, this is really, really nice. So I'm not sure, I wholly believe this. There's lots of things we want to do. We don't want to limit our analysis to these 14 universities, right? There's reasons we did, but so we want a larger, more representative sample, hopefully update the time period. The data are getting a little dated. The outcome variable measured in 2017. We want to better control for audience size. I think there have been other suggestions earlier, and Carl, your idea of like weighting interconnectedness by size of the journal, something we could do, looking at the variance of the CV index that have been proposed, the D-score, disruption score. There might be disciplinary differences. We have a lot of in some of these effects, right? Things might operate differently in life sciences from other fields. And we may also assess curvilinear effects, but curvilinear, like moderating effects is like, but we need to do that. We could also potentially measure some of these mechanisms that we've theorized about. We're giving that some thought to. Happy to add to that list. In sum, interdisciplinary research has greater impact as measured by number of citation count. This is especially the case when the audience is interconnected. The scholar's audience is interconnected, or they have a dense network ready to receive their work. We also find that IDR work is more likely to be highly disruptive. But this effect is tempered when the audience is interconnected. So the likelihood that IDR becomes highly disruptive is flattened, is tempered when the audience is interconnected. In short, the scholars' networks or the scholars' audience matter, and audience characteristics or features, or maybe what you call like structure of the audience, like interconnectedness, shape the use of IDR by subsequent scholars. Okay, so thank you to Emma Fulbright this year at Leiden. I'm grateful for funding from Fulbright from the National Science Foundation that funded me and Russ Funk to do this work, and also Clairvit, the Web of Science folks, and a fellowship from Indiana that allowed us access to the Web of Science. Thank you very much, and I look forward to more great questions and comments.